When you close your eyes and picture the roaring 20s, specifically the criminal underworld of that era, who do you see? I bet I can guess. You see a man with a thick neck, a white fedora, a cigar clamped between his teeth, and a scar running down his face. You see Al Capone. It is always Capone. He is the poster boy. He is the face on the t-shirt, the villain in the movie, the name that every single person knows. Chicago, the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, the tax evasion. It's a great story. It is a great story. But here is the problem with great stories. Sometimes they overshadow the truth. The truth is, while Al Capone was busy getting his picture in the newspaper and acting like a celebrity, there were other men who were smarter, quieter, and ultimately much more powerful, who were actually building the infrastructure of organized crime. Capone was a force of nature, sure, but he was also reckless. He was loud. The men we are going to talk about today understood something Capone never quite grasped. Crime isn't just about violence. Crime is a business. And if you run it like a business, you don't just survive Prohibition, you survive for 50 years. Exactly. Today we are going beyond the headlines of the Chicago outfit. We are going to New York, to the boardwalks of Atlantic City, and into the backrooms where the National Crime Syndicate was born. We are talking about the architects: Charles Lucky Luciano, Meyer Lansky, Dutch Schultz, Arnold Rothstein. These are the names that actually shaped the 20th century underworld. Capone was a medieval warlord. These guys were the founding CEOs of a Fortune 500 company of crime. So let's peel back the curtain. Let's look at the forgotten gangsters of Prohibition. To understand why these other figures matter so much, we have to look at the landscape of the 1920s. We tend to think of Prohibition as this chaotic free-for-all, but in New York, it was evolving into something much more sophisticated. And it starts with a man who was technically before the main Prohibition era, but set the stage for everything: Arnold Rothstein. The brain, that's what they called him. Arnold Rothstein is fascinating because he wasn't a thug. He was the son of a wealthy businessman. He understood numbers, odds, and leverage. He's famous for fixing the 1919 World Series, but his real contribution was teaching the next generation. He was the mentor. While Capone was learning how to brawl in Brooklyn before moving to Chicago, Rothstein was in New York taking young street toughs like Lucky Luciano and Meyer Lansky and teaching them how to dress, how to talk to politicians, and most importantly, how to collaborate. Collaboration is the key word here. The old world of crime, the so-called Mustache Petes from Sicily, they were very insular. If you weren't Sicilian, you couldn't be trusted. If you were from a different village in Sicily, you couldn't be trusted. Rothstein was Jewish, Lansky was Jewish, Luciano was Sicilian. In the old rules, they shouldn't have been working together, but they saw the money on the table. Rothstein taught them that the color of money is green, not Italian or Jewish. So you have this young Turk movement rising in the Lower East Side. You have Luciano and Lansky, who are best friends effectively. They form a partnership that transcends ethnic lines. Capone had non-Italian associates, but the Chicago outfit was very much a brute force instrument. The Luciano-Lansky alliance was built on strategy. Let's talk about that dynamic. Luciano provided the muscle and the connection to the Italian mafia structure, while Lansky provided the financial genius. Lansky was a wizard. He understood offshore banking before it was even a term. He understood that if you could hide the money, you could keep the power. Capone kept his money in safes and under mattresses. Lansky moved his through international channels. And then there's the third leg of this stool, or perhaps the wild card: Arthur Flegenheimer, better known as Dutch Schultz. If Lansky was the brain and Luciano was the executive, Schultz was the pure, unadulterated aggression of the Bronx.
Schultz is a terrifying figure. He controlled the beer supply in the Bronx and Harlem. He was known for being incredibly cheap and incredibly violent. He would wear cheap suits, count every penny, and kill anyone who crossed him without a second thought. But unlike Capone, who wanted to be loved by the public, Schultz just wanted to win. He was involved in the numbers racket in Harlem, taking it over from African-American operators like Stephanie St. Clair. That's a crucial point. The numbers game, the illegal lottery, was a massive revenue stream. While Capone was fighting over beer trucks, Schultz and the New York factions were diversifying. They were getting into industrial racketeering, gambling, unions. They were building a portfolio. And we have to mention the Atlantic City Conference of 1929. This is the moment that proves how far ahead of Capone these guys were. While Chicago was a war zone, the major crime bosses from across the country met in Atlantic City. Who organized it? Meyer Lansky and Lucky Luciano, with Nucky Johnson hosting. Capone was there, of course, he was the celebrity guest, but the real work was being done by the others. They were discussing territories, supply chains, and how to stop killing each other so much because it was bad for business. It was the first attempt at a national syndicate. Right, Capone was actually yelled at during that conference by the other bosses for bringing too much heat. He was too loud. The New York guys looked at him and thought, this guy is a liability. They were moving toward a corporate model, and Capone was still acting like a feudal lord. The pivotal moment, the moment that truly separates the forgotten gangsters from the chaotic violence of Capone, is the Castellammarese War and its immediate aftermath. This wasn't just a gang fight, it was a revolution. It was the overthrow of the old guard by the new corporate generation. So set the scene. It's 1930. In New York, you have two major old-school bosses, Joe the Boss Masseria and Salvatore Maranzano. These are the Mustache Petes we mentioned. They hated each other. They were fighting a bloody war for control of the Italian-American crime world. And caught in the middle were the younger guys, Lucky Luciano, Vito Genovese, Frank Costello. Luciano was technically working for Masseria, but Masseria was uneducated, gluttonous, and stubborn. He refused to work with non-Italians like Lansky and Siegel. He was holding them back. The war between Masseria and Maranzano was bad for business. Bodies were dropping everywhere, police heat was intense, and profits were down. So Luciano makes a cold, calculated decision. He decides to end the war by eliminating his own boss. April 15th, 1931. This is a legendary date in mob history. Luciano invites Masseria to lunch at a restaurant called Nuova Villa Temeraro on Coney Island. They eat, they drink, they play cards. Masseria thinks everything is fine. Then, Luciano excuses himself to go to the bathroom. As soon as he's gone, 4 men burst in. Bugsy Siegel, Vito Genovese, Joe Adonis, and Albert Anastasia. They riddle Masseria with bullets. When Luciano comes out of the bathroom, the boss is dead. Police arrive, and the story goes that they asked Luciano where he was, and he just said, "I was in the can. I wash my hands a lot." It was the end of Masseria. Now, Maranzano is the winner. He declares himself capo di tutti capi, boss of all bosses. And this is where the brilliance of Luciano and Lansky shines. Maranzano thought he had won. He thought he was the new emperor. He started demanding huge tributes and making lists of people he wanted to kill, including Luciano and Genovese. He was just another tyrant, exactly like the one they just killed. Luciano wasn't going to trade one dictator for another. He wanted a democracy, or at least a board of directors. So less than 6 months later, in September 1931, the second shoe drops. Maranzano calls Luciano to a meeting at his office on Park Avenue. He plans to have Luciano killed there, but Luciano and Lansky were 5 steps ahead. They knew the layout of the office. They knew Maranzano had hired Jewish hitmen because he didn't trust the Italians anymore, but he didn't know what they looked like. So Lansky sends in his own men, disguised as IRS agents. They walk right past the guards into Maranzano's office, shoot him, and stab him.
With Masseria and Maranzano dead, the old world was gone. This is the main incident that changed history. Luciano didn't take the title Boss of Bosses. He abolished the title. He created the Commission. The Commission. This is the governing body of the American Mafia. It included the heads of the 5 families of New York, plus the Chicago outfit, Capone's crew, though he was on his way to jail by then, and representatives from Buffalo and other cities. It was a court. It was a legislature. It was a way to settle disputes without shooting each other. This is why these guys are more important than Capone. Capone ruled by fear. Luciano ruled by consensus. The commission allowed organized crime to stabilize. They divided territories, they set rules on drug trafficking, they arbitrated labor racketeering disputes. It turned the mafia into a national institution. But there was one man who didn't quite fit into this new corporate structure, our friend Dutch Schultz. Schultz was a member of this new order, but he was losing his mind. He was under investigation by a special prosecutor named Thomas Dewey. Dewey was relentless. He was tearing Schultz's empire apart. Schultz goes to the commission and says, "I want to kill Thomas Dewey." Now, killing a cop is bad. Killing a high-profile prosecutor, that is suicide for the entire organization. It brings down the full weight of the U.S. government. The commission, led by Luciano and advised by Lansky, tells Schultz, no, "You cannot touch Dewey." Schultz gets furious. He storms out. He says he's going to do it anyway. He basically declares that he is bigger than the commission. And this is the ultimate test of the new system. What do you do with a board member who goes rogue? In a normal company, you fire him. In the National Crime Syndicate, you liquidate him. The commission took a vote, a unanimous vote. Dutch Schultz had to die to save the rest of them. The execution of the Schultz contract is one of the most famous hits in mob history, and it perfectly illustrates the ruthless efficiency of this new organization. It happened at the Palace Chop House in Newark, New Jersey in 1935. Schultz was there with his top accountants and bodyguards tallying up numbers. The commission sent Murder, Inc., the enforcement arm of the syndicate, to handle it. 2 men walked in and opened fire. They hit everyone. Schultz was shot in the bathroom. Ironically, just like Masseria had been vulnerable, Schultz was caught off guard. Schultz didn't die immediately. He lingered for hours, delirious, rambling a stream of consciousness that was transcribed by a police stenographer. It's this haunting, surreal poetry of a dying gangster. A boy has never wept nor dashed 1,000 Kim. But the message was clear. The individual does not override the corporation. With Schultz gone, the syndicate absorbed his rackets. His numbers games, his restaurant unions, they were all divided up among the 5 families. It proved the system worked. They had self-policed. They had prevented a war with the government by sacrificing one of their own. And this set the stage for the post-Prohibition era. While Capone was rotting in Alcatraz, his mind deteriorating from syphilis, Luciano, Lansky, and the others were pivoting. Prohibition ended in 1933. Most people think the mob would have collapsed then, but because of Lansky's foresight, they were already moving into gambling. They looked at Las Vegas. Bugsy Siegel, Luciano's childhood friend, went out there to build the Flamingo. But even more importantly, they looked at Cuba. Meyer Lansky forged a relationship with Fulgencio Batista, the dictator of Cuba. They turned Havana into the playground of the world. Casinos, hotels, nightclubs, all legal, all owned by the mob. This was the golden age. They weren't hiding in speakeasies anymore. They were owning the hotels. They were infiltrating labor unions, controlling the docks, the garment district, the construction industry. If you built a building in New York City in the 1940s or 50s, you were dealing with the Genovese or Gambino family, which all stemmed from Luciano's structure. And look at their fates compared to Capone. Capone died a broken man at 48. Lucky Luciano was eventually deported to Italy, but he lived like a king in Naples, still exerting influence until he died of a heart attack at the airport meeting a movie producer. He died a free man, essentially.
And Meyer Lansky, the financial wizard, he lived to be 80 years old. He died in Miami Beach, in his own bed. He was never convicted of a serious crime. The FBI chased him for decades, but he was too smart. He didn't have a vault full of cash. He had shell companies and Swiss bank accounts.
That is the legacy. Capone left a legend of violence. These forgotten gangsters left a system. They integrated organized crime into the fabric of the American economy. They made it so that you couldn't buy a loaf of bread, hail a cab, or bet on a horse without putting a penny in their pocket. So when we look back at Prohibition, we need to look past the scar-faced man in the white fedora. Al Capone was the noise. He was the distraction. But Luciano, Lansky, Schultz, and the Commission, they were the signal. They were the ones who realized that the greatest crime wasn't breaking the law, it was organizing it. History remembers the celebrity, but the world was shaped by the board of directors. And that is the true story of the gangsters history forgot. So we have spent a lot of time dissecting Chicago. We've looked at the blood on the pavement of North Clark Street and the flashing lights of the Lexington Hotel. But if you stop the story there, if you let Al Capone take the final bow, you are missing the actual mechanics of how organized crime took over America. Because Capone was in many ways an outlier, right? He was loud, he was public, he was almost like a celebrity who happened to kill people. Exactly. Capone was the face of Prohibition violence, but he wasn't necessarily the brain of the operation on a national scale. While Capone was fighting for headlines, there were men in New York City who were fighting for legitimate power. They were building a corporate infrastructure that would outlast Prohibition by decades. To understand them, we have to leave the Midwest and head to Manhattan, the Big Apple, the true capital of vice. And we can't talk about the forgotten gangsters without starting with the man who taught them everything, the man they called the Brain, Arnold Rothstein. I've heard the name. Isn't he the guy connected to the 1919 World Series?
He is. He's the man widely credited with fixing the World Series, turning the Chicago White Sox into the Black Sox. But that was just a hobby for him. Rothstein was the bridge between the old world of disorganized street thugs and the new world of organized crime syndicates. Before Rothstein, being a gangster meant you beat someone up for their wallet or ran a small dice game in an alley. Rothstein looked at crime and saw a corporation. So he brought a CEO mindset to racketeering. Precisely. He was the one who realized that prohibition wasn't a political issue, it was a supply chain issue. He was one of the first to set up a massive system to import high-quality liquor from Scotland and Canada, rather than just distilling rock gut in a bathtub. He understood logistics. And because he was the bank, the financier, he attracted protégés. Two kids in particular watched every move he made: Charles Lucky Luciano and Meyer Lansky. Now, those are heavy hitters, but they weren't bosses yet. Not yet. In the early 1920s, they were students. And this dynamic is fascinating because it breaks the ethnic mold that Capone was stuck in. Capone was Italian, operating in a largely Italian hierarchy, though he worked with others. But in New York, you had Luciano, a Sicilian, and Lansky, a Russian Jew, forming a partnership that was tighter than blood. They looked at the old mustache Petes, the traditional Sicilian bosses like Joe Masseria and Salvatore Maranzano, and they laughed at them. Why? Those guys were terrifying. They were terrifying, but they were obsolete. The mustache Petes only wanted to work with other Sicilians. They spent all their time fighting over village feuds from back in the old country. Luciano and Lansky, under Rothstein's tutelage, realized that the only color that mattered was green. They wanted to work with anyone who could make money. Jews, Irish, Italians, it didn't matter. This philosophy is what eventually birthed the National Crime Syndicate. But before they could build that syndicate, they had to survive the chaos, right? New York wasn't exactly peaceful.
It was a war zone. And this brings us to one of the most erratic, dangerous, and frankly overlooked figures of the era, a man who terrified even his own allies, Arthur Flegenheimer, better known as Dutch Schultz. Dutch Schultz? The name sounds almost comical, like a cartoon character. There was nothing funny about him. While Lansky was the accountant and Luciano was the diplomat, Schultz was the rabid dog. He was the beer baron of the Bronx. He controlled the beer supply in New York with a level of brutality that made Capone look reasonable. Schultz wasn't interested in corporate structures or peace treaties. He was interested in winning, usually by shooting everyone else in the room. How did he fit into this group of businessmen if he was so volatile? Poorly, very poorly. But he was powerful. He had an army of gunmen, and he was making millions, not just from beer, but from the numbers racket in Harlem. And that, specifically, is where we find a story that history almost completely wiped away. The war between Dutch Schultz and the Queen of Harlem, Stephanie St. Clair. Wait, a woman standing up to Dutch Schultz? A woman, an immigrant from the Caribbean, and a fierce independent operator. Stephanie St. Clair, known as Madam Queen, ran the policy banks, the illegal lottery, in Harlem. When Prohibition started winding down, gangsters like Schultz needed new revenue streams. They looked at Harlem and saw the numbers game making a fortune. Schultz decided he was just going to take it. I assume the standard procedure was to just roll in with machine guns. That was Schultz's plan. He started intimidating the local policy bankers, beating them, driving them out of business. But St. Clair didn't flinch. She waged a public war against him. She took out advertisements in newspapers denouncing the corrupt police officers who were protecting Schultz. She attacked his men. She allied herself with a man named Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson, who would go on to be a legend in his own right, and they held the line. It's an incredible piece of history. This black woman in the 1930s staring down the most violent sociopath in the New York mob. Did she win? She survived, which, when you're fighting Dutch Schultz, is winning. But Schultz eventually forced his way into the Harlem rackets through sheer attrition. However, his aggression was his undoing. And this leads us to the pivotal moment where the forgotten gangsters decided to change the rules of the game forever. The formation of the Commission. We hear about the Commission in movies, but how did it actually come together? Was it really a meeting? It was a series of meetings, but the philosophy was solidified in 1931. By this time, Rothstein had been murdered, shot over a poker game, ironically. The torch had passed to Luciano and Lansky. There had been a massive conflict called the Castellamarese War, a bloody struggle between the two old guard bosses, Masseria and Maranzano.
Luciano, in a masterstroke of treachery and ambition, orchestrated the deaths of both of them. He killed his own boss, then killed the guy his boss was fighting? Exactly. He cleared the board. With the old guard gone, Maranzano had briefly declared himself capo di tutti capi, boss of all bosses. Luciano hated that title. He knew it just put a target on your back. So, after Maranzano was dispatched, by Jewish hitmen disguised as government agents, a Lansky touch, Luciano called a meeting in Chicago. Back to Chicago, briefly. He gathered the heads of the families and proposed a new structure. No more boss of bosses. Instead, a board of directors, the commission. Each family would have a seat. Disputes would be settled by vote, and unauthorized murders were strictly forbidden. It was the democratization of crime. It sounds incredibly corporate. It was survival. Lansky famously said, "We're bigger than U.S. Steel," and he meant it. But there was one problem with this new corporate piece. Dutch Schultz. He wouldn't get with the program? Schultz was under investigation by a special prosecutor named Thomas Dewey. Dewey was relentless. Schultz, being Schultz, went to the commission and said, "I want to kill Thomas Dewey." The commission, led by Luciano and Lansky, said absolutely not. Killing a high-profile government official would bring the full weight of the FBI and the National Guard down on everyone. It was bad for business, so Schultz was told to stand down.
He was, and he refused. He left the meeting in a rage, declaring he would do it anyway. He was going to assassinate a federal prosecutor in the streets of New York. The commission realized they had a rogue element. They held a vote. The board of directors voted to liquidate a shareholder. They put a hit out on Schultz. In October 1935, Schultz was eating at the Palace Chop House in Newark, New Jersey. He was in the bathroom when hitmen from Murder, Inc., the enforcement arm of the syndicate, walked in. They sprayed the restaurant with bullets. Schultz lingered for hours, delirious, mumbling a surreal stream of consciousness that was transcribed by a police stenographer. It was the end of the wild man and the total victory of the businessmen. You mentioned Murder, Inc. That sounds like a comic book name, too. The press came up with the name, but the reality was grim. It was a squad of contract killers, mostly Jewish gangsters from Brooklyn, led by Louis Lepke Buchalter and Albert Anastasia. They were on retainer. If a Boston, Cleveland, or Detroit had a problem, they didn't use their own guys. They called New York, and Murder, Inc. sent a professional. This kept the local boss's hands clean. It was outsourcing murder. It's terrifyingly efficient. But you mentioned other cities. We've been very New York-centric, but you said there were forgotten gangsters elsewhere. We have to talk about Detroit. The Purple Gang. The Purple Gang. I remember a line in an Elvis song about them. Yes, Jailhouse Rock. But the real Purple Gang was the stuff of nightmares. Detroit was unique because it was right across the river from Canada. It was the funnel for Canadian whiskey. The Purple Gang was a group of predominantly Jewish gangsters who controlled that flow, and they were so violent, so unpredictable, that even Al Capone decided not to fight them. He made a deal with them instead. He bought their whiskey rather than try to take their territory. If Capone is afraid of you, you're doing something very wrong or very right. They were known for the Collingwood Manor massacre, where they lured 3 defectors to an apartment and executed them. It was sloppy, though. That was their downfall. Unlike Lansky and Luciano, the Purple Gang didn't evolve. They stayed thugs. They killed each other off or went to prison. By the mid-1930s, they were mostly history, absorbed by the Italian partnership. And what about Atlantic City? You hear about Nucky Thompson from the TV show. Based on the real Nucky Johnson, Enoch Nucky Johnson. He wasn't a gangster in the traditional sense. He was a political boss. He ran Atlantic City, which was the playground for all these guys. In 1929, Johnson hosted the Atlantic City Conference. This is arguably the most important event in the history of American organized crime. What happened there? Imagine walking down the boardwalk in 1929 and seeing Al Capone, Lucky Luciano, Meyer Lansky, Frank Costello, and Nucky Johnson all strolling together, breathing the salt air. It was a convention. They stayed at the best hotels, they threw parties, but during the day they hammered out the treaties that would define the underworld. They divided up the country. They agreed on territories. It was the Treaty of Versailles for gangsters. And Nucky just hosted it? He wasn't afraid of the law? Nucky was the law in Atlantic City. The police worked for him. That's why they held it there. It was neutral ground. That photo, the mental image of them on the boardwalk, really symbolizes the era. You had the Chicago muscle, the New York brains, and the political protection all in one frame. Capone was actually arrested in Philadelphia right after leaving that conference. Was that a setup? Many historians think so. Some believe Capone arranged it himself to go to jail for a short stint on a weapons charge, just to let the heat die down from the St. Valentine's Day massacre.
Others think the New York guy set him up to get him out of the way, because remember, Capone was loud. The new breed, Lansky and Luciano, they hated the headlines. So while Capone sits in a cell, the syndicate moves on.
They didn't just move on, they diversified. This is the key to why these forgotten gangsters had a more lasting impact than Capone. Capone was booze. When Prohibition ended in 1933, the Chicago outfit had to scramble to pivot. But Lansky had been preparing for the end of Prohibition for years. What was his plan B? Gambling, casinos. Lansky looked at Cuba. He looked at Las Vegas before it was Las Vegas. He realized that people would always want to gamble. He set up carpet joints, luxury illegal casinos across the country. He traveled to Havana and forged a relationship with the dictator Fulgencio Batista. He turned Cuba into the mafia's offshore bank and playground. Capone never had that kind of foresight. Capone was a brute force instrument. Lansky was a visionary architect. It's amazing to think that while the FBI was chasing bootleggers, Lansky was building an international gambling empire. And he did it quietly. That's why he's often forgotten by the general public compared to Capone. Capone is an icon because he fits the mold, the fedora, the Tommy gun. Lansky looked like a librarian. He was 5'0", wore glasses, and spoke softly. But if Lansky gave an order, people died. If Lansky said invest here, millions of dollars moved. He was the only one of the original 1920s heavy hitters to die of old age in his own bed in Miami. That is the ultimate victory in that life. It is. Luciano wasn't so lucky, but he still outmaneuvered the system. In 1936, Thomas Dewey, the man Schultz wanted to kill, finally got Luciano. He convicted him on a prostitution charge. It was a trumped-up charge, frankly. Luciano was a lot of things, but he wasn't a pimp. But the charge stuck. He was sentenced to 30 to 50 years. So the head of the commission is in prison. Does the structure crumble? No. And that proves the genius of his design. The commission continued to function. Frank Costello, known as the Prime Minister, took over the day-to-day operations in New York. Lansky handled the money. And Luciano? He ran the family from his prison cell. But the story gets even stranger. World War II broke out. Don't tell me the government asked the mob for help. They absolutely did. It was called Operation Underworld. U.S. naval intelligence was terrified of saboteurs on the New York waterfronts. The docks were controlled by the mob. They also needed intelligence for the invasion of Sicily. So the U.S. government went to prison, sat down with Lucky Luciano, and made a deal. That sounds like fiction. The government partnering with the crime boss they just locked up? Truth is stranger than fiction. Luciano gave the order, and the docks locked down. No fires, no strikes, no sabotage. He also provided contacts in Sicily that helped the Allies during the invasion. In exchange, after the war, his sentence was commuted on the condition that he be deported back to Italy, so he was exiled. Exiled, but not retired. He set up shop in Naples and later tried to move to Cuba to be closer to the U.S. action. The famous Havana Conference of 1946 was essentially a welcome back party for Luciano, hosted by Lansky. Sinatra was there, all the bosses flew down, but the U.S. government pressured Cuba to kick him out, so he went back to Italy, where he died years later. But think about the contrast. Capone died in 1947, his mind ravaged by syphilis, essentially a child in a man's body, powerless. Luciano died a wealthy, influential man who had negotiated with superpowers. It really highlights that there were two types of gangsters in Prohibition: the meteors who burned up and the planets that kept orbiting. And the planets are the ones who shaped the America we know. The syndicate didn't disappear when the 18th Amendment was repealed. They embedded themselves into labor unions, construction, sanitation, and trucking. No, we should see the startup phase of a massive illicit conglomerate. We should see Arnold Rothstein teaching the curriculum. We should see Meyer Lansky balancing the books. We should see Lucky Luciano chairing the board. And we should see Stephanie St. Clair fighting for her corner of the world. Capone was the mascot. These people were the machinery. It completely changes how you view the era. It wasn't just chaos. It was the birth of an industry that, in many ways, is still with us. The names change, the rackets shift from bootlegging to narcotics or cybercrime, but the structure, the idea of a syndicate, that was invented in the back rooms of New York speakeasies by the men history forgot to put on the posters. And that is the real legacy of Prohibition. Not the alcohol, but the organization. So if we want to really understand crime in America, we have to look beyond the scar. We have to look beyond Capone. We have to look at the shadows behind him, where the real work was being done. That's where the true story lies. Incredible. Who would you say is the most underrated of them all?
if you had to pick one? That's a tough question, but I keep coming back to Meyer Lansky. Think about it. A Jewish kid from the streets of New York who navigates the most violent, anti-Semitic waters of the Italian mafia never becomes a made man because he can't, but ends up being the boss of the bosses in everything but title. He held the purse strings, and in that world, the guy with the money is the guy with the power. He didn't need a gun. He had compound interest, the accountant of the mob. The accountant, the survivor, the forgotten genius. Capone is a cautionary tale. Lansky is a success story, as dark and twisted as that success may be. And that's the disturbing truth of the Prohibition era. Well, I think I'm going to look at that boardwalk photo a little differently now, as you should. It's not just a photo of criminals. It's a photo of the founding fathers of the underworld. Thanks for taking us down this rabbit hole. My pleasure. Just remember, history is written by the victors, but in the underworld, sometimes the victors are the ones who stay quiet enough to be forgotten. Words to live by. Or words to avoid getting whacked by, precisely. Until next time, see you then.